The Syrian regime raises its flag in Eastern Ghouta as rebel forces leave their last stronghold near the capital. Is victory for Assad just around the corner? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the rebel evacuation from Douma. It was one of the longest held opposition areas during the war in Syria, but almost overnight that has come to an end. Rebel fighters from Jaysh al Islam have reportedly agreed to leave the town of Douma in Eastern Ghouta, give up their weapons and head to northern Syria. It's seen as a huge blow to the opposition and a massive win for the Assad regime. For 5 years, the area was under siege, with its residents facing immense food shortages and relentless airstrikes. 6 weeks ago, Assad's forces upped their campaign to reclaim it. Now that they have, what will it mean for the opposition's fight to oust the regime? That debate in a moment, but first, here's Sandra Gatman.
They're leaving their homes and abandoning their last stronghold near Syria's capital. Buses are carrying hundreds of opposition fighters and civilians from Eastern Ghouta to northern Syria, marking the end of a long and violent battle against the Syrian regime. The regime is now in control of this Damascus district. Soldiers are uncovering a network of underground tunnels that allowed the rebels to hold on to Eastern Ghouta for so long. But the resistance was eventually brought to its knees. Heavy bombing by the regime and Russian forces, as well as Iran-backed militia, flattened the city. They claimed to be targeting terrorists. Nearly 1,000 civilians were killed here. Some were poisoned in chemical attacks that the regime denies it carried out. In the end, Assad's upper hand appears to have forced the rebels to surrender, allowing fighters and their families to evacuate from Eastern Ghouta. But the rebel group Jaysh al Islam denies there was ever a deal to retreat. There's no question that opposition forces in Syria are firmly on the back foot. Since 2016, they've lost more and more territory. And now, millions of dollars in funding from the US government, which sustains services in areas the rebels controlled. President Trump has even signaled a total pullout.
We'll be coming out of Syria like very soon. Let the other people take care of it now. Very soon.
A US withdrawal could further weaken the rebels' position around the negotiating table and leave Washington out of the circle of players. Already, a new alliance between Turkey, Iran, and Russia have raised eyebrows about the prospect that they may in fact be the new power brokers in Syria. Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined here in the studio by Yasser Tabara. He is a senior fellow at the Omran Center for Strategic Studies and a former spokesman for the Syrian interim government. From Arezzo in Italy, we have Joshua Landis. He's the director of the Center for Middle East Studies at Oklahoma University. And completing our panel in Washington, D.C., we have Nicholas Harris. He's a Middle East fellow at the Center for a New American Security. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Yasser Tabara, let's start with you. Is this a win for Assad and his Russian backers, given that there's been this evacuation in Eastern Ghouta?
Well, I think if you look at the situation from a strategic point of view, during the time that they focused on Al-Ghouta and the immense criminality that they've exercised in killing over 1,800 civilians and displacing over 28,000 civilians completely to an entirely different part of the country, consistent with their ethnic cleansing and demographic changing practices over the past 5 years. But if you look at the picture strategically, you'll see during that campaign that they did all of this criminality during, they've actually let an entire region in the northwest completely go from under their control entirely into the control of another nation. We're talking about Afrin in the northwest. You're talking about they've let the Americans and other coalition members basically bombard Deir ez-Zor and kill some of the Russian and Syrian regime troops without any response that that can be mentioned. During that period, Daesh engaged in a number of hit-and-run tactics where they actually re-entered Bukamal and Mayadeen, and they've lost some control over some of the oil fields there.
So your argument in a nutshell is brutality and, your words, criminality in order to take back this part of Syria while they've lost more ground elsewhere.
Exactly.
Okay, so Joshua Landis, is that how you see it?
Well, clearly the regime, the Syrian regime, has been successful in about 65% of the country. That's obviously good for Assad, bad for the rebels, but it's not a 100% win. The United States claims to own about 30% of Syria in the northern region, where it's helping Kurdish troops, YPG, and the Syrian Democratic Forces, as well as in Tanf, and is blocking highways in and out of Syria. So the United States owns about 50% of Syria's major resources: oil and gas, water, agriculture. Turkey is on its way to conquering perhaps 10% of Syria. Northern Aleppo, Afrin is just cleaned out, and will probably take parts of Idlib province as well, and in alliance with various Syrian rebels. And so Syria is likely to be divided into 3 zones in the future.
Okay.
Of course, we don't know whether the United States will remain. President Trump seems to be rather fickle about staying for the long haul in the north. And so that's the situation. It's good for Assad in the Ghouta. It's bad for Assad north of the Euphrates and in the areas where Turkey is imposing its rule.
Nicholas Harris, was it a good thing that Ghouta was evacuated by the rebels, especially when some point to the fact that the strongest rebel group that was there in Douma was Jaysh al Islam, and they're not necessarily the most moderate of rebels around? Was it a good thing?
You know, this is a very difficult question for a lot of different commentators, because with that question is also the question, was it a good thing that the Assad government and its allies, the Assad alliance, essentially sieged and starved the people of the East Ghouta into submission? You know, that in and of itself is a horrible thing. But the broader narrative I think that we can take as we enter 2018 over the course of this next year is that Syria is no longer a cohesive state. It is a geographic space that is fragmented into different zones of control. And the U.S., as has been mentioned, has a rather sizable zone of control. Turkey has another sizable zone of control. The Assad alliance has the largest by land area zone of control and population. And then you have sort of groups of rebel zones. The way I would frame it is that the operation in the East Ghouta was the brutal conclusion of the fact that the Assad government cannot allow an active insurgent stronghold on the doorsteps of Bashar al-Assad's throne in Damascus. And when you look at U.S. strategy moving forward, the U.S. is banking on the fragmentation of Syria and the slow constriction of Assad and his allies to gain more territory.
Right. Yasser, as Nicholas mentioned, brutal conclusion. You spoke about it being criminality. However they got there, they got it back, right? They displaced hundreds of thousands of people. They killed over 1,000 people, injured scores, starved, besieged, you name it. So with that in mind, given the Russian backing of Assad and the fact that they tried this tactic and it worked, no matter how ugly, is there any possibility that they would want to negotiate now?
Well, I mean, first of all, let's revisit what was mentioned in terms of the Assad control, the Assad regime control of 65% of the Syrian territory. I think that in itself is highly disputed if you look at the facts and figures, and if you really dissect the area that is supposedly under the control of the regime.
So Joshua said 65%. You dispute that?
Well, I mean, it's. Are you talking about the presence of the Syrian Arab army in these areas, or are you talking about scores of different militias that are loyal directly to the Iranian Republican Guard? or Revolutionary Guard, or are you talking about Russian troops, or are you talking about militias that are not that are loosely affiliated with the Syrian Arab
So how about
Army?
I let you expand on it in a moment? Let's get Joshua to clarify then. 65%. We have Yasser saying, what do you mean by 65%? That's not all Assad. That could be Iranian, that could be Russian, that could be a whole medley of players.
He's absolutely right. The Assad regime is weak today, although the military is stronger than it's been for about 3 years, and is probably going to get stronger. There's no doubt that there's a lot of militias that still operate. Some are pro-regime militias. There is widespread banditry, taking of bribes. There's not what you would term as a normal government that is not corrupt and that runs efficiently like the United States. But it is increasingly government control. And one suspects that many of the militias will be squeezed out as time goes on. Now, the United States, by taking away resources, is hoping that it will be able to bring Assad to his knees. That's what Tillerson described before he was fired. That by impoverishing Assad, the Russians, the Iranians, they can turn Syria into a quagmire. This will force the Russians to abandon Assad, impose UN-mandated elections, which Assad will lose. That's the American plan. We don't know if the new national security advisor is going to follow the Tillerson plan, or whether Trump wants to just get out of Syria. So we don't really know what the plan is. Syria is weak today, but it's been getting stronger since the Russians entered in 2015.
And again, I'm not sure.
I'm not that it will get stronger.
Okay.
I'm not sure what is meant really by it's getting stronger. I mean, let's again talk about trends and figures. If we look at the reports of those killed in the Syrian Arab Army, we'll see that the higher number of the young men who were forcibly conscripted into the Syrian Arab Army were from areas that have been basically displaced and that were populated, whether it's Mu'addamiyya, whether it's the Western Ghouta, whether it's from different parts of Homs and Hama. We are not talking about an army that is regrouping or that is regaining any sort of strength in terms of rank and file conscription. I mean, most of the conscription that what we hear about is actually forced conscription. And we even are seeing that in the aftermath of the Eastern Ghouta disaster, where a lot of the, I mean, we have about 200,000 civilians that have refused to actually take the deal and leave. Right. And specifically because they're afraid that their sons will be forcibly taken into the Syrian Arab Army and fighting on other fronts. This is not an indication of a strong army by any stretch of the imagination. Right. The role that the Iranian militias have played in encircling Damascus and encircling Ghouta during that campaign does not point to any real presence of the Syrian Arab Army.
Yeah, and it's going to be interesting to see that relationship between the Iranian militias, the Russians, Assad forces, and so forth, as they reclaim more and more of this territory, if they do. Nicholas Harris, let me ask you, with your proximity to the Beltway, or within the Beltway, given that John Bolton's around, Joshua Landis mentioned new national security advisor. Will he follow the Tillerson plan, or is his appointment an indication that Trump wants to get the hell out of Syria, as he suggested, I think, in a tweet?
The fact of the matter is that there's an active debate ongoing right now within the U.S. government, within both the Trump administration, the broader U.S. government, including the U.S. military and career civil servants, about what to do in Syria. There seems to be two poles to this discussion. One pole is to try to continue to maintain a small U.S. footprint in northern and eastern Syria, but in a way as to support local Syrian partners, particularly the Syrian Democratic Forces Coalition, and any other coalition partners like France, the United Kingdom, and potentially the Gulf Arab states that want to stabilize that zone.
Right.
That would, over time, lead to a slow pullout of the U.S. from Syria, because it's a limited mission. It's a stabilization mission, and it's a mission that lends itself ultimately to a deal between the SDF and the Assad government in order to secure that territory. The other pole of the discussion really takes up the argument of how do you diminish Iran in Syria? And that has always been the great question mark about the Trump team strategy. You cannot diminish Iran in Syria without linking the US-led coalition's effort in eastern Syria to the civil war in western Syria, whether by supporting armed opposition in southwest Syria in Daraa against ISIS and thereby linking with the Israelis in order to contain Iran's and Assad's southward expansion, or, which is what has been the focus of news over the last few weeks and months, do you come to a grand bargain with Turkey? Because fundamentally, the Turkish-controlled zone in northwest Syria is the most valuable and strategic real estate if you want to apply pressure on Russia to find a way to get to a deal in a larger agreement between the United States and Russia. Yeah. And that is why Turkey's role and the U.S.-Turkish relationship moving forward in Syria is vital.
Yeah, that's going to be interesting to see if that indeed plays out in that way. Joshua Landis, just before I wrap up, we've seen government airstrikes in Eastern Qalamun, negotiations about evacuations and so forth. So are we going to see more and more of this Eastern Ghouta type thing happening, starting off with Qalamun next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the Syrian government is determined that they're going to do the same thing in the Daraa area. They want to, of course, take Idlib back. I think Turkey is going to contest the government and will probably win on parts of Idlib. And increasingly, the rebels don't have much strength left unless it's the Turkish, backed by the Turkish army. So even though Assad is weak, as our other commentator has explained, I think very eloquently, the opposition is really finished. And Assad will assert his authority, as weak as it may be, over much of the rest of the country. And it will be divided into these three groups. The big question mark today is, what will America do? Do the Kurds have a future as an independent statelet in the north, or will they be fought over by Turkey and the Assad government?
So there's a line that stood out for me. Let's ask the Syrian on set, who is in opposition to Assad. The opposition is really finished. Is that true?
Well, I mean, just as the last speaker mentioned, Assad is not going to be able to reassert control over the entire territory again. I think that is a thing of a fantasy at this point. I do believe that the attention should be focused right now, the international community's attention, on the question of accountability. There has been a tremendous amount of criminality that has been exercised over the past 7 years. A lot of different parties have exercised criminality, but the most brutal and statistically the most vivid is practiced by...
But has it worked and has it finished the opposition?
I mean, if the definition of success is, killing, 500,000 Syrian civilians and displacing another 3 million and internally displacing half of the Syrian population and losing, 50% of the Syrian territory, the definition of success is that, then yes, absolutely, it has succeeded. The international community is advised to go back to the drawing boards and look at Syria as a place that is very much a prime candidate for re-explosion and deal with the root causes of the situation and the problem. And I think accountability, holding criminals accountable, is the first step towards in that direction. Going back to talking about a political solution, perhaps a la the Geneva Communiqué or a different version of it, will potentially put us in the right direction once again. But without that, I don't think we will see peace in Syria or the region anytime soon.
A prime candidate for re-explosion. Well put. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I've got to move on. But gentlemen, I thank you very much. Yasser Tabara, Joshua Landis, and Nicholas Harris. Thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, disturbing letters sent across the UK call for attacks on Muslims. Is enough being done to tackle Islamophobia? And China hits back at the United States with tariffs on imports worth $3 billion. Are we on the verge of a full-blown trade war? Stay indoors and hide your hijab. That's what some Muslims in the UK are being advised online. It's a precaution against potential attacks on April the 3rd that were called for in leaflets sent across the UK. So serious are the threats that counter-terrorism police have been brought in to investigate. But is that enough? We'll ask our panel of guests in a moment. But first, here's this report by Adil Halim.
Britain first! Fighting back! Britain first! The UK is no stranger to tension between far-right groups and its Muslim minority. But now, an anti-Muslim letter distributed across the UK is trying to exploit that hatred. It's a call to violence, sent anonymously, that targets Muslims and offers a point system based on the severity of the attack. The scale starts at 10 points to verbally abuse a Muslim, 25 points to pull the headscarf off a Muslim woman, 50 points for throwing acid, 100 to beat up a Muslim, and even more for torturing or butchering a person. The top prize goes to anyone who will nuke Mecca. British counter-terrorism police are investigating. No one has claimed responsibility for the letter, but whether it's meant as a rallying cry or just a twisted attempt at humor is of little comfort to the Muslim community. This vile letter campaign sent to Muslims across the UK has caused deep distress and alarm. 4 Muslim MPs received suspicious packages containing the letter.
How come we still don't have a proper definition of what Islamophobia is? And how come we've got incitement to religious hate, but only one person has been charged since 2006? Clearly, that's not strong enough.
A series of deadly terror attacks in the UK last year led to concerns over retaliation against the country's large Muslim population. Those fears played out last June when a van plowed into worshippers near the Finsbury Park Mosque in North London, killing 1 man and injuring at least 10 others. Attacks on mosques in the UK more than doubled in 2017 from the year prior. But many argue the government is trying to clamp down on the problem. Last month, leaders of the far-right group Britain First were jailed for a series of hate crimes against Muslims. Across the Atlantic, similar fears exist. A Muslim woman is suing a Michigan hospital after she was attacked by a man in the emergency room lobby. Some community members have taken to Twitter to ease concerns. For those concerned with the Punish a Muslim Day flyer, don't be. Just stay vigilant, be aware of your surroundings, don't travel alone, things you should be doing every day. Don't let them instill fear in your heart. Others are trying to douse fears through humor. I told my uncle about this Punish a Muslim Day BS, and he asked, who's going to give them the points? But some are going a step further by sharing a letter as a countermeasure, calling instead for April 3rd to be Love a Muslim Day. It gives points for good deeds like smiling or inviting a Muslim to your home. One Twitter user said, "This is what the message should have been." The hope is random acts of kindness will prevail over the calls to attack Muslims. But the question remains, how did the UK get to this point? Adil Halim, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Birmingham is human rights activist Salma Yaqub. In London, we have Anasat Tikriti. He's the president of the Muslim Association of Britain. And completing our panel is Alan Craig. He's a spokesman for the UK Independence Party, or UKIP. Thanks all of you for joining us. Salma Yaqub, let me begin with you. Today is the day, April the 3rd. Punish a Muslim Day. Now, any nutter can create a flyer that's hateful. What's interesting, I guess, is that this got legs. It became viral. It actually became a thing. How did we get to the point where such a hateful flyer could actually become ubiquitous and become something that's prevalent on the streets and in the communities around the UK?
Well, the reality is that what is actually ubiquitous is anti-Muslim feeling now. It's really sad. I've I'm born in this country, I'm raising my children in this country, and there's no other place that I'd rather be. The people here are fantastic. But unfortunately, due to the political situation over the last 10, 20 years, there has been a slow and steady increase in anti-Muslim prejudice, which has not just come from the fringes, the kind of usual suspects, the far right, but even in mainstream discourse. So we are seeing in the figures when it comes to crimes against Muslims. I mean, just last month we had a young woman, only 18, a teenager student, actually beaten up, not by men, by 6 young women, and she actually has died. And this kind of thing we did not experience before in this country.
Right.
But there is now a level of prejudice and people feeling that they can act in this way, which didn't occur before. And I see Punish a Muslim Day as just one part of that bigger picture.
I see. Alan Craig, is anti-Muslim sentiment now mainstream in your country?
No, it's not. No, I think Salma, with due respect, is talking through the top of her head. I think Muslims are very welcome in our society. They're a main significant part of our society and are welcome. I think one of the problems is, of course, we do conflate and confuse Muslims with Islam. If she said that there's a growing suspicion about Islam as a religion, as an ideology, well, I think she'd probably be right. But that does not translate into hostility towards Muslims. We can, of course, all of us cite instances. I could cite an instance, say in Oldham, where 3 solo white men have recently been beaten up by Muslim gangs in Oldham. And this is an issue that's been going on for many years. It was first reported by the police chief in Oldham back in 2001, when he was said that something like 65% of the violent attacks on the streets were by what he called Asian men on white people. But that doesn't actually mean that all Asian men or all Muslim men are hostile and do it. We can, of course, find examples. But overall, I think my experiences as I live in the East End of London, and my experience of my Muslim friends and so on, is that actually we have a welcoming society. But there is an issue about Islam, and of course we do need to debate that. If you go back 50 or 60 years, the rising ideology then, or the risen ideology then, was communism, and people wanted to discuss and debate that. Well, Islam as an ideology, as a religion, is new to these islands, and we need to be able to discuss it. But don't confuse that with anti-Muslim hatred. Okay.
So, Salma, Alan accused you of talking off the top of your head. I'm going to give you a chance to respond in just a second. Let me get Anas's response first. Anas, Alan Craig's saying Islam, like any other set of ideas, should be open to criticism in a free society. That's what's happening. Muslims themselves are not being attacked. What do you think?
The facts allude to something totally different. Facts show that Islamophobic or attacks driven by hatred of either Islam or Muslims, I don't see what the difference is. If people want to criticize Islam, they're going to criticize those who also believe in Islam. But the facts are facts. Last year in London alone, there were more than 1,000 attacks on Muslims. There are hundreds of attacks on Islamic centers and mosques and community centers where Muslims attend. So the facts are actually different. Now, I would say, having said all that, that Britain is, I mean, it's not a racist society. It's not an Islamophobic society. But I think it would be amiss. It would be a big mistake to deny the fact that we do have a problem with racism, we do have a problem with discrimination, we certainly have a problem with Islamophobia. Just one point that Alan mentioned I'd like to pick on. He said that Islam being a new ideology, Islam arrived at these shores more than a century ago. If Alan was to visit his local mosque, the East London Mosque, and visit the archive room, he'd see documents and minutes of meetings going back to 1904, more than 110 years ago. So, and the first mosque we have recorded in Britain was in the late 19th century. So actually Islam isn't new to these shores. And Islam is not a sort of a newly arrived ideology or religion.
Right.
So I would suggest, I mean, just once again reiterating that absolutely, do ask, do, if you wish, even criticize. That's absolutely fine. But the fact of the matter is we don't have that kind of open dialogue or debate about Islam where Muslims are allowed to air their views away from any sort of discrimination or targeting or attack.
Okay, so Salma, let me ask you to fold your response to Alan into... Let me ask you to fold it into a response to this question. Do you have any sympathy for those who might see for example, terror attacks happen in their country, whether it's 7/7 in London, whether it's Manchester, conducted by people who call themselves British Muslims, conducted by people who claim to be doing it in the name of Islam. And for those who reflexively, yes, they might be upscaling, they might be unfairly scapegoating and so on and so forth, but people who then have a reflexive fear of Islam as a system and who tend to be a little bit prickly about it. Do you have sympathy for them? And do you then understand the context within which a lot of this criticism and even Islamophobia comes from?
Of course. And the response of mainstream Muslims has been consistent, that these actions are condemned. They are not reflective of the faith. They are not reflective of Muslims as a collective or a group. And unfortunately, when some people talk about these incidents rather than focus on the individuals concerned, there is a form of collective punishment. And I think that's what's dangerous. It's not that we can't empathise with that, of course, and that's why there are very visible expressions, things like "not in my name" and showing solidarity and humanity and concern. And all these people who carry out these attacks actually see other Muslims who aren't like them as fair game, as it were. So it's not as if other British Muslims are bomb-proof in any way. So the physical danger, as well as the backlash, is experienced by British Muslims who have consistently come out and condemned such actions. What's sad is that when people from other communities commit certain acts, it's taken as either a mental health issue or an individual issue in that person. We don't suddenly start saying, well, why are all white men doing X, Y, Z? What is wrong with the culture that we have so many rapists and so many murders taking place? Because rightly, the individual responsibility is what is focused on. Sadly, when it comes to the Muslim community, we see this stereotyping. And for a faith which is adhered to by billions of people to different degrees, and let's not forget that Muslims criticise the faith from within. It is a constant interpreting and challenging and criticism. That's part of the faith itself. So no one is saying don't criticise faith, don't criticise ideas. I'm all up for that, welcome that. But it's actually a bit disingenuous when some people who claim that this is about a debate and an open and honest intellectual debate actually just use it as a cover to attack Muslims and justify making it a hostile environment for Muslims. And I think we need to call that out.
Okay, so talking about the hostile environment, Alan, bear with me for a second. I want to paint a picture of the zeitgeist a little bit, right? So I've got some stats from the European Islamophobia report. It says in 2016, 47 Muslim places of worship were attacked in the UK. That number rose to 110 just 1 year later. Muslims in custody rose by 50% in the last decade. Muslim males now make up 15% of the male prison population, despite only being about 6.3% of the country's population. Between 2015 and 2016, verbal attacks against Muslims increased by 29%. Couple tweets to come your way as well. Now, Katie Hopkins, right? She tweeted something on Twitter. March 2018, London has a higher murder rate than New York, and Ramadan's not yet begun. That's Katie Hopkins doing Katie Hopkins' thing, but Ian Paisley, MP of DUP, goes and retweets that, right? She does it with an I Love Israel t-shirt, just for good measure there as well. And then we have Leave.eu saying British multiculturalists feed Islamic fundamentalism, Londonistan built on the sad ruins of English Christianity. They've got a picture of Sadiq Khan there. They call it Londonistan. They say 423 new mosques, 500 closed churches, 100 Sharia courts. They're associating a democratically elected mayor of London in a secular political system with Sharia courts. They've got him up there on this particular day, April 3rd, Punish a Muslim Day. Now, you can't tell me that all these people are not goading Muslims and are not singling out Muslims for being Muslims. You can't tell me they just want to have a nice, rational debate about, I don't know, the Quran and the Hadith.
Yes, I can. Yes, I can. We live in a democracy here.
Katie Hopkins wants to have a rational debate about the Quran and the Hadith.
Hang on. You asked me a question. Let me answer your question, OK? We live in a democracy and people are allowed to be rude about other people, especially if they put themselves up as senior politicians, OK? I could quote to you if I wanted to, and I don't, but I could quote to you the thousands of English and Sikh girls who have been groomed, and they're talking about thousands of who have been groomed by predominantly Muslim men, okay, over decades. And this national catastrophe is beginning to surface quite a lot now. Now, I could, if I wanted to,
it's by men,
blame Muslims in general, but
it's
I don't.
Disgusting that you are repeating
let me finish my point. Let me finish it.
Stereotypic tropes.
Let me finish my point, can I, please? Can I finish my point? I've listened quietly to you.
What about the police
all that you
rings?
had to
What
say,
about
so I'd
the
like to make my
political
point.
rings?
No, I'm
What
sorry,
about
but you've
the
got to allow me
church?
to have
Are
my
you going to
say.
say-
Let me
are
finish
you
my
just going
point.
to be
Why
silent
can't I
about
finish my
that?
point? Selma, you
I
really
thought you
shouldn't keep
believed in
interrupting
democracy.
people. When I listen
So
quietly
go
to
ahead,
you,
say your
Okay.
point.
Selma,
I
let's
can't.
give
I
Alan a
listened
minute.
quietly
Go
to you
ahead,
all
Alan.
the way through while you made your points. Thank you very much. I'd like to do that. Thank you. Okay, so now we have thousands of English girls and Sikh girls who have been groomed by predominantly, something like 90% Muslim men, okay, and it's a particular form of grooming of child sexual abuse that has taken place. And actually, I think as a society, we are quite sensible. We do not say all Muslim men are like this, but there are some like so. So we draw a distinction, okay, between those that perpetrate this sort of thing. Many of them do it in the name of their religion, may I say, and those that do not do so. We are able to distinguish between it. And I think that is a mature society. It is not predominantly Islamophobic. It is not, at least, it is not predominantly Muslimophobic any more than it's predominantly Sikhophobic or Hinduophobic, okay? We do have the right, however, to question the ideology behind it. And I think that's a very valid thing to do. And I hope we should be doing more of it, if I'm honest.
Your selective quoting is exactly an example of the insidious and sly manipulation, which you seem to be a good example of. If I could easily sit here and say, well, I can quote X amount of priests and the church and make sly insinuations about Christianity as a whole, but that would be wrong, because you know what? It's about people in power who exploit that, whether it be priests, whether it be in mosques, whether it be in, outside taxi ranks, whether it be Hollywood producers. It's always about abuse of power and exploitation. And when people like yourself come along and try and cause further division by saying this is about English or Sikh or Muslim, the way that you just did, that is what's dangerous. And actually, I would dare say quite un-British, and not an example of what I think and what I'm proud of as a British citizen is the best of humanity. Because whilst
Selma,
there are people
thank you for telling me what is
the
British.
kind of divisive rhetoric that you're promoting, I know, and you laugh because you don't see me as British, maybe, and you think that maybe I'm a bit above my station.
No, it's because you don't see me as British. Because you don't see me as British.
Okay, well, she said that was
I am
British.
I haven't denied your Britishness whatsoever.
Okay, so let's not debate over the semantics. She said it was un-British.
Okay, I would like to defend.
Very briefly, please, because I want to give Anas the final word here. Poor Anas has been squeezed in between the two of you here. He hasn't got a word in. Alan Craig, 20 seconds, please, and then I'm going to give Anas the final word because we're running out of time. Alan Craig?
Sure, I do not think we are particularly a Muslimophobic society, any more than we are, as I said, Hinduophobic or Sikhophobic. We do, however, have real questions about Islam as the rising ideology in our society, and I think it's perfectly reasonable. If Muslims tend to conflate criticism of Islam with criticism of themselves, that's their business. In a democracy, we're allowed to do that, okay? So we can say what we like about Islam, provided we don't say anything hateful about Muslims themselves.
Anas Takriti.
Well, I think that Selma put it quite succinctly, that by what we're seeing in the Me Too movement, for instance, and before that the Savile investigation, and before that various activities of the church and the such, that all show that probably Christian, middle class, white men are of a particular ilk. And again, that would be wrong, simply because someone who commits a crime, they shoulder the responsibility for that particular crime, and you don't go and paint a brush over the thousands upon thousands upon thousands of white, probably people of faith, men of faith. We don't do that, Alan, and you should know better. But the fact that you say that the likes of Katie Hopkins and probably even Tommy Robinson, maybe, I don't know where you stand on him, want to engage in a constructive debate is laughable and a little bit demeaning. And I think it's sort of problematic as to how you want to put forward your message. The fact of the matter is that we live in a country which I share Selma's pride in. I think it's a welcoming society more, and I agree with Alan on that. I don't think this is a racist society that we live in. I don't think it's an Islamophobic society in general. However, once again, I think that we have a problem of Islamophobia. We do have a problem with racism. And unfortunately, Alan is, in what he said and how he said it, is symptomatic of that. I think there needs to be a debate and a dialogue, and absolutely, I would welcome an open debate and a constructive dialogue about Islam or any other. But the fact of the matter is, what we're doing today is we are targeting Muslims because there are too many headlines. There are too many officials that come representing probably even the mainstream and talking about people's faith, talking about people's... I mean, by the way, even today we're meeting on Punish a Muslim Day, that reprehensible letter that went around the country. But yet every single media interview I have been attending ends up somehow asking Muslims about their behavior, asking Muslims what they should do better, asking Muslims whether they're integrated or not. Ultimately, the victims in this case being held accountable or held even responsible for the fact that they are being attacked. I think we need to shift the kind of discourse and narrative. I think we need to change the conversation. I think we need to start asking the right questions.
Okay. Listen, I'd love to continue. I hope you all felt that I gave you a fair opportunity because I really have to wrap. I've got to move on to another debate. But I really appreciate you all taking the time, having this healthy debate with us. Alan, Salma and Anas, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers.
I want to emphasize that China is confident to cope with any acts of trade and investment protectionism. The U.S. behavior starts a very abominable precedent, as the tariff on Chinese products openly violates the World Trade Organization's regulations. The abandoning of the multilateral trading system tramples the multilateral rules. The U.S.'s disgusting conduct may trigger a chain reaction of trade protectionism and cast a shade over the revived global economy.
They're the two largest economies in the world, and they're not afraid to go head-to-head. Last month, Donald Trump said he wanted to raise duties on steel and aluminium imports. And while several countries were exempt, one that wasn't was China. And they're not impressed. Not a nation to take things lying down. Beijing hit back with their own tariffs on 128 U.S. imports, including pork and wine. And it's already hurting the American economy after U.S. stocks made their worst start to a second quarter since the Great Depression. So are we on the verge of a full-blown trade war? And if so, who is to blame? Well, let's ask the experts. Joining us from Singapore is Alex Capri. He's a senior fellow at the Asian Trade Center. And in Washington, D.C. is Saurabh Gupta. He's a senior analyst at the Institute for China-America Studies. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Alex, the two biggest economies in the world engaging in tit-for-tat trade actions, recoiling into protectionism. It seems to be bad news for everyone. So why on earth did Trump start it?
Well, look, this is in line with the political platform that Donald Trump ran on. It's also in line with the ideology that is consistent with his team of trade advisors, which is an ideology of economic nationalism. It's an ideology that views trade as a very zero-sum game. And it's, some would say a fairly blunt instrument when it comes to engaging other countries. It's also an ideology that favors bilateral deals and bilateralism and actually frowns upon and rejects multilateralism. So it is consistent with both the ideology and the political platform that Mr. Trump ran on. It is, of course, running contrary to what the better part of the world is now aligned with, which is a multilateralism, the mega trade deals and free trade agreements that involve numerous countries. So, again, it's causing a lot of problems.
Right. So, Saurabh, Beijing retaliated. It's become tit for tat. Should Beijing have been a bit better than that and not got sucked into this game?
Yeah, it's important to understand when to retaliate and when not to retaliate, and the proportion of retaliation. I think Beijing has called it correct on this occasion. One should not retaliate if there might be a legitimate case to be brought against Beijing by the U.S., and the U.S. should do that at the WTO. The U.S. has the grounds on which President Trump has imposed his steel and aluminum tariffs are very, very flimsy. if there is not retaliation against that, and mind you, this retaliation, it wasn't, I wouldn't call it immediate retaliation. Beijing asked for consultations with the US with regard to making compensation for the tariffs that were being imposed. And that is a means that is perfectly valid within the multilateral trading system.
Right.
The U.S. turned around and said that it does not want to engage in that conversation, and therefore Beijing laid out that list. That list is proportional to the amount of tariffs, to the amount of losses that Beijing is going to suffer. So I think actually it's important to retaliate, because if one just turns one's cheek, one is going to get slapped again. And what we have coming down the line on the Section 301 investigation on China's IPR practices might be much, much more severe than what we have seen on the steel front. And therefore, I think it's important just to have a shot across the bow to let everybody know that how serious matters can devolve to.
So, Alex, how likely is it that this will escalate into a full-blown trade war? And what would that mean?
Well, I think if this is mismanaged, I think if, for example, there isn't a period of perhaps consultation between Washington and Beijing, perhaps some coming to the table to negotiate, which by the way, many people would say that if you look at Trump's behavior, for example, with the tariffs on steel and aluminum, after the very bombastic announcements, after the tweets and the publicity, he's actually walked back a fair amount of those. So a number of those countries, a number of major trading partners of the United States have received exemptions, right? The EU, South Korea, Mexico, Canada. So some would say that the purpose of this Section 301 investigation may be to get Beijing to the negotiating table. And there certainly are very, very fundamental systemic behavioral patterns that China Inc., if you like, has engaged in over the years, which have not, in fact, exhibited fair trade practices. So to answer the question, could this escalate into more tit for tat and more retaliation? Yes, it could. But it's possible also that we might actually see negotiations, and we may actually see some positive developments come out of this.
Right. So, Saurabh, when you basically have, I don't know, Ali and Foreman fighting, you know, who's going to officiate this thing? Who's going to kind of be the referee? Who's going to get into the ring to push these people apart? Is it the World Trade Organization, and how impactful can they be?
It must be the World Trade Organization's dispute settlement body. It is perhaps the crown jewel of the multilateral trading system, and this is the one avenue, the one venue at which many of these problems can be resolved. Even if the two countries go tit for tat against each other, but then are amenable to going through that dispute settlement body process, I think much can be salvaged. My real great fear is that on the impending tariffs which are going to come following the Section 301 IPR investigation of China's IPR practices, President Trump has already put out a memo. The list of items on which the tariffs are going to be placed are about to be announced. But I mean, let's also just hang back a little bit out here. It's after that's announced, there's going to be a 30-day public comment period. So nothing's happening right away. We have at least a 30 or a 60-day cooling off period during which time the two parties can talk. But my real anxiety is that the U.S. does not really, with regard to the IPR case, and it is planning to impose tariffs of up to $50 billion, the U.S. says that this is not an issue which is resolvable by the WTO's dispute settlement body. Just one of 4 elements in its investigation of China's IPR practices, it says, is amenable to a settlement at the WTO's dispute settlement body. The rest of it cannot be settled, and probably will just have to be dealt with by unilateral means. And when it comes down to unilateralism, it's going to be, that's the time I think things are really going to get very serious, because it's $50 billion worth of retaliation is different from, you know, the steel retaliation steel and aluminium we're talking about is maximum $3 billion.
Yeah. Okay, Sarab.
We're talking much larger sums, and on the basis of unilateralism.
Okay, Sarab, Alex, I've got to wrap, unfortunately, but a lot of people watching this thinking, you know, how does this impact me practically? How is this going to affect me? And we're going to try and tease that out over the coming weeks and months and follow the story closely. For the moment, I'm going to thank both of you, Alex and Sarab. Thanks for joining us here on the Newsmakers.
I know, and the people of this country know, that Mandela will lead this country to freedom.
She is the lady who gave up everything for the people.
And that's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Ghouta. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Kenyan opposition figure Miguna is once again deported and then hospitalized. We'll ask the man himself what he plans to do next. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.